No. 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 Why are they all USB? Look, I'm not talking about the cable that actually plugs into the computer. I'm talking about this. Why is this here? Why is it not hardwired? This port is more expensive, it's another point of failure, and it's likely to be worn out long before a hardwired cable would be. Hardwired cables are more flexible, they'll last longer, and they ultimately contribute less to waste. Now, of course, before I continue, let me also say that I'll largely be looking at mechanical keyboards with blue switches and blue equivalent switches. However, if you look around, you'll find it's similar for all types, with the USB cable being something that's also more commonly not displayed, so it may sometimes appear hardwired while actually not being hardwired at all. The reason I'm narrowing my searches for this type is because it's what I use, and there are far too many different types to sort through, as I'll explain later.
Oh, but you're not going to be moving your keyboard so it won't get worn out. It'll allow you to unplug your keyboard and take it with you. If something happens to the cable, you can just replace it.
Shut the fuck up. 1. If you actually pay attention to the position and location of a keyboard, you'll notice it actually has a lot of movement. Each slight motion the cable or keyboard has contributes a good deal of wear and tear to the USB port on the keyboard. It doesn't need to be a large motion, it just needs to be a slight wiggle. If you take a piece of sandpaper and give it a very slight motion, you'll find that it slowly ebbs away at the material it's on. This same exact thing happens with USB ports, which is exactly why they have a lifespan that's measured in number of plugins and unplugs. 2. If you want to take your keyboard with you, you can do that without unplugging the fucking cable from the goddamn keyboard. How exactly is a hardwired cable getting in the way of you packing or carrying the thing with you? Do you realize that keyboards are packaged and shipped around the world? Are you trying to say those cables are shipped separately from the keyboards so that the customer then has to open the damn thing and solder in the hardwired cable? This is such a bullshit argument, it's laughable. Moreover, do you have any idea how few people in the world take their keyboards with them? Most people simply use a laptop when they want to bring a computer somewhere. Not only that, but those USB ports, as I've already stated, are more expensive. 3. The cable isn't the fucking problem. The likelihood of a cable being ruined, regardless of whether or not it's hardwired, is incredibly low. Hell, in my life, I've never had a keyboard's cable go bad, because that's not the weakest point. The weakest point in a design with a cable is the USB port and plug, as those can and do get worn out. If the port or plug gets worn out, the connection to the keyboard won't be complete. If that connection is incomplete, there'll be no way for it to communicate with or be registered by the computer. In other words, if there's no connection, then the keyboard can't be used with the computer.
Well, if you don't like it, don't get a wireless keyboard.
These are not wireless keyboards. These keyboards don't have a battery, they don't have the ability to connect with Bluetooth, and they don't have the ability to connect with Wi-Fi. These are wired keyboards, so they can't be used without their cable. They're completely useless without their cable. All this change actually does is makes it so you're less likely to have a functional keyboard for a long span of time. All the design does is guarantees the keyboard will be worn out before the actual keys are worn to a point of lacking function, as yes, those keys also have a specific lifespan. However, the lifespan of each individual key press is long enough that a single keyboard could easily last the average person over a decade. What better way is there to force a person to purchase a new keyboard than to ensure their current keyboard no longer functions than to design it with a guaranteed point of failure? There shouldn't be anyone defending this design, as it is planned obsolescence. It's a guarantee that you'll have to purchase a new keyboard in far less time than you may want, and that's before accounting for the cost. Some of these keyboards can go for over $200, and most of the decent ones may go for over $100. Here, since Newegg seems to have a shitty selection range, let's just look at Amazon, checking the first 3 pages for a search of new 10-keyless keyboards, shortened to a search of TKL keyboard. In these 3 pages, you'll see 49 different keyboards. Breaking them down into categories, you end up with 19 that are connected with a USB cable, 20 that are wireless, and only 10 that are hardwired. Now, I have nothing against wireless, and I even have one for my media computer, but that's not what I'm looking for, so let's ignore those 20 and instead focus on the wired ones. Of the 19 that are connected with the USB cable, you have a selection of magnetic, creamy, optical, membrane, aqua, red, brown, sea salt, moonlight, and super banana key switch variants. And for a moment, what the fuck is with those last 2? Sea salt, moonlight, and super banana? Really? The fuck? Word naming aside, let's get back on topic. I referred to those key switch types as variants, not because they're being used on different keyboards by different manufacturers, but because the key switches themselves may actually differ from each other while being in the same category. One red may not be equal to another red, so even when trying to compare two keyboards of the same overall design, they can be vastly different. Yet just those listed variants make it incredibly annoying to sort through, given that it's a list of 9 different key switches. Of those 19 USB port keyboards, 3 of them even try to hide the fact that a USB cable must be plugged into them rather than being hardwired. One of them does this by fucking with the contrast of the image, making it difficult or impossible to see, depending on the screen you're looking at it on. One of them only has a single product image that shows a cable connected to it at all, and on that image, they don't even bother to show that it is a USB cable, as the angle hides it and makes it appear as though it's hardwired. The last one then pushes this notion further by hiding the USB port on the underside of the keyboard. Yet, I'm also looking for a blue key switch that's at least close to Cherry MX Blues, and of those 3 pages, there wasn't a single keyboard I was looking for that had a variant of a blue key switch. So how about the hardwired? I don't actually want one that requires a USB cable to be plugged into it, so we can throw those 19 off to the side and focus on the hardwired ones. The ones requiring a USB cable to be plugged into them are all trash regardless of the key switch used, and I want something that'll actually last. With only 10 hardwired keyboards from those first 3 pages, it should at least be faster to sort through them, but it also means far fewer options and a much smaller likelihood of finding what I actually want. So, of those 10, we have a key switch variant selection range of 3 unspecified types: Essex Scissor, Membrane Hybrid, Optical, Standard Membrane, Yellow, and Red key switches. Again, none have a blue variant I actually want, but this is all also before a couple further issues. You see, my current keyboard uses a rather cheap version of a blue key switch, one that's actually worse than the previous version of my keyboard. Not much else was changed between these keyboards, so I don't know for certain whether it's the key switches that are the cause, the software for the keyboard, or something else in the keyboard's hardware. However, I'm willing to bet more on the key switch type itself that's the fault of my issues. The problem I failed to mention is an issue with it sometimes having double inputs or ignored inputs. On one occasion, I was able to make a key stop getting ignored and having double inputs by cleaning it out with a bit of 99% pure isopropyl alcohol. That, unfortunately, also led to the keycap getting weakened and eventually breaking off though, so I had to swap it out for a keycap from my previous keyboard. This also leads into a third issue, but we'll get into that in its proper order. Although, I must also say that I'm not entirely sure if double and ignored inputs are entirely the fault of the keyboard, as Windows itself may also be partially at fault, as even the mouse I use and my controllers can sometimes have the issue. So, for the first issue, you'd need to check reviews, sorting through all the bullshit AI and fake trash, all the people posting reviews either in the wrong place or for a page that's had its fucking product changed while using the same damn reviews as before, and while also trying to sort through for reviews that could be any number of versions of keyboards on the same goddamn page, since it may not always actually specify which selection their review is for. In that, you'd need to look for a way to determine whether or not multiple inputs or ignored inputs are a common issue, and I can even tell you now that while looking through some of this stuff, I did find reviews mentioning it for some. The second issue is ghosting and key rollover. I'll explain a little bit more about this later, but if you type at a decently fast pace or ever need to press multiple keys down at the same time, then you'll need to make sure that you have a keyboard with little or no ghosting and a high key rollover. Preferably, it's best to find one marked as being N-key rollover, meaning that every single key on the keyboard can be simultaneously pressed and registered. This is important for many cases, especially if the design leads to one or both shift keys not functioning with one or more other keys. Like with typing, if you're gaming, you may also find that you need the input limit to not be restricted to specific combinations, but you'll also need to ensure that the key rollover is high enough that you can use every entry you could possibly need. Typically, this means you only need to ensure there's only a low key rollover of 4 or 5 simultaneous inputs, since you'll typically only have one hand on the left keyboard and the other on a mouse. However, we have the technology for N-key rollover, and you never really know for certain whether you'll need more than that number, so why would you settle for something so low? Especially when ghosting is a combined factor, you'll want to make certain you have it exceeding the bare minimum. Just like I'll mention a bit later, if you have some ghosting, some inputs may be ignored, as it'll take a moment for the keyboard to actually register a key's release, so it could be treated as still being pressed after it's actually released, reducing your actual input count. Finally, the third issue has to deal with the strength of the keycaps. This is a rather annoying issue with mechanical key switches, as they typically use a plus sign shape that the keycaps then socket onto. Those sockets are thin, round pieces of plastic that extend from the center of the keycap's underside with no real support to strengthen them. If those extensions had something to strengthen them, the keys wouldn't be able to be depressed, as the keycap must reach around the upper portion of the key switch. Ordinarily, this may not be much of a problem, nor may it seem like one. Keycaps are pretty small, so you can't get a whole lot of leverage and break them off, and their travel is a simple up and down, but that doesn't guarantee anything. With such a wide range of keyboard designs, you can easily find something, much like what I'm using, that doesn't have the key switches inlaid, where they're technically protected by the surface plate of the keyboard. Those inlaid versions do have an issue with keeping clean though, which can prove to be an issue in its own right. So you'd have to then determine whether you want something that's easier to keep clean, or if you want something that can be bumped in such a way that the keycaps can be broken. So, okay, you can get metal keycaps, right? Well, technically you might be able to, but they'd be rather expensive, and mechanical key switches aren't exactly tailored around the idea of the weight of metal. That image was Amazon's results though, so how about Newegg? Yeah, Newegg Surge is even worse, which is rather sad when you consider that Newegg used to be the go-to for all computer hardware. They've kind of been devolving into a discount Amazon site, so most of what they have is just from third-party sellers, but without the high traffic of Amazon, the majority of what's on their site has no reviews. Those reviews, even with the fake shit mixed into them, is something that can help a person decide whether they want to risk a purchase, especially if they're properly looking at the negative reviews so as to gain a good understanding of the drawbacks. But we're not done, because there's still one more site for me to check, so what about performance PCs? That site has always been trash for as long as I've used it, but maybe they'll come through for once. Yeah, nope, I didn't think so. They have literally 0 results. Also, yes, I did try the same search phrase as I used on Amazon and Newegg, but the result was the same. This site has never been any good. Newegg was also given the same search as performance PCs, keeping it a little more narrow, but the results on Newegg ended up being even less relevant than broadening it to state mechanical keyboard as part of the query. Even if you could find metal keycaps, however, with plastic being the common material, if you put metal keycaps on a key switch that isn't designed for the added weight, you might find that it affects the force requirements to press the key enough for a response. That requirement may then affect the overall feel and your typing speed, as even the return speed, that speed at which the key raises, may be slightly affected. The sound could also be changed, and if the key switches are inlaid, then you'd have to contend with whether or not the metal keycaps can even fit, as there's the possibility that they could be slightly thicker than the original plastic. The keycaps you use as a replacement could also end up with a different shape or angle, giving a completely different feel than the more standardized shape used on keyboards. All of these issues must be accounted for when trying to find a keyboard, which shows the annoyance and difficulty I have when trying to find a type I want. Those issues are also before accounting for the fact that it's quite possible, as at least one was shown to be, that those metal keycaps might actually be plastic for the part that connects to the keyboard. You know what though? I suppose I need to be fair to Newegg and performance PCs. I can't just look at the more popular site that is Amazon. I even said Newegg used to be the go-to for computer stuff, and it's still my go-to for actual computer hardware, so I think we need to check it. I did check some of it already, but we should still do a little more with it. I may as well also get a quick search of performance PCs done too though, but the search on these two sites isn't going to be for keycaps again, since that'd be completely redundant. It needs to be for keyboards, but I'm not going to waste a lot of time, so I'll only go through one page on each. Hell, if you can't find what you're looking for in the first page, most people would probably give up, so it's just an indictment on their search system if you can't find what you need. Let's go over this quick, since the results are quite similar to what I found on Amazon. For the Newegg TKL keyboard search, out of the 44 keyboards, there were 18 with a USB cable that plugged into them, 17 wireless, 4 hardwired, and 5 that couldn't be definitively determined as being either USB or hardwired. Those 44 also include the 8 sponsored results too, as the page was only set to show 36 results. Of those 44 keyboards, you have Membrane, Red, Magnetic, HyperX, Brown, ROG NX Snow, Aqua, Cabbage Tofu, Matcha Latte, ROG NX Storm, OmniPoint 2.0, Optical, and Blue key switch variants. Again, in that list is another that makes me ask what the fuck, but also say fuck Asus. Yes, I know I'm pronouncing them wrong, but I don't give a shit, it sounds stupid and I don't respect them, so let's move on. Mixed in with those listed key switch types in the Newegg keyboard search were also some with issues. Specifically, 4 didn't specify what type of key switch they used, so only the uncaring or completely ignorant would likely bother purchasing any of those, and 8 had inconsistent information on the product page, stating one variant in one spot, but then being more broad or stating another variant in another spot. Also, for all the HyperX key switches, do note that if they mention a color, then the color for them is stated, but that brand is a bit more confusing, as may be possible with other types I've listed. Very few of the HyperX key switches I've seen while looking around actually had a specific variant name, so I'm assuming the unspecified HyperX key switch is its own type. If it's not, then it's just something that's unspecified, but even the fucking colors that was popularized by the Cherry MX brand makes things too damn confusing, since it doesn't actually describe anything about the key switch type, it just expects you to know the difference. Next up is performance PCs. Why do I even bother? This site still sucks. Seriously, you can't even bring up some keyboard results when a search is done? It has keyboards as you can see in the screenshot, but why the hell would I go sorting through the broken site if running a search comes up with no results? Hell, the drop-down menu itself is garbage since you don't have to click for it to appear. You just have to hover your cursor over it and you can see just how much of the page gets hidden. Yeah, that's the entire page that gets hidden. Trying to do anything on this site and in the browser leads to this damn annoyance popping up and taking a second to fade away each and every single fucking time I accidentally move my cursor over one of those damn menu options. I hate this site, so I'm not using it for anything else in this video, especially since its search clearly doesn't work. All of these issues stem from such simple things, and if keyboards weren't actually needed, it'd be a damn miracle for their markets to not nosedive off a fucking cliff. That cliff would be pretty small though, as people would quickly ignore them, but as much as the AI morons want to push systems controlled purely by voice onto people, I'm still hopeful that such a thing will never happen, and I'm also doubtful it ever will happen. Also, some of the images I showed at the introduction of the video did come from a different site than 3 I've been using so far, but it's one I've never before used. Specifically, those images came from mechanicalkeyboards.com, and though it might be safe, you never know for sure. However, not all online purchases should be consolidated down to just a few sites, so it could very well be safe, and it does seem put together relatively well, so finding TKL keyboards on it was pretty damn easy to do. The information that site has is also pretty useful, as you can see in the screenshots of the keyboards I collected from it, and it did prove to be rather helpful for determining the connection method of the keyboards. However, even when looking at that site, the issue still exists, and there's also the problem of brand recognition on that site, with it specifically narrowing brands to be for unknown or unpopular brands, such as Ducky and Leopold. This means no Corsair, Logitech, Razer, and so on. On the contrary though, their layout is exactly what retailers and manufacturers need to be doing to help make choosing a keyboard easier. Their site is quick, it allows you to filter into the type you're looking for, then you can easily see what key switch variants are available on a per brand basis on the keyboard's product page. This simplicity doesn't actually fix the issue with the numerous differing types of key switches, but it does at least help simplify matters, making the shopping experience far less tedious and far less likely to make you want to say fuck it and give up. Although they do have a cursor hover drop-down menu that's annoying as fuck, just like Performance PCs has, so they need to change that to requiring a click. I'd also like an option to actually filter into hardwired keyboards to make the searches faster and not have to check each individual product page for that information. Also, not all the keyboard product pages have actual information about whether or not the keyboard's USB cable has to be plugged into it rather than being hardwired, but there is at least an effort made so that most either directly state it or have a picture that shows it. These factors actually mean they're being more transparent and honest than other retailers and even manufacturers, such as Amazon or Logitech. If other retailers can copy their model, and if they can actually expand how many brands they have, a large part of the issues with keyboards could actually be mitigated, even without fixing the issue of the key switches. It obviously wouldn't fix the issue of planned obsolescence with USB cables, but at least there'd be some transparency. The issue of the number of key switch types and variants would also still exist, but descriptive factors could then be further added. With that said, I'm still not entirely open to that idea either. Simply adding transparency of how you're being fucked isn't going to help you not get fucked. People would just become used to it, or they'd forget or not realize that such things could be created in a way that doesn't actually require they have a weakness to their design that'll cause them to become quickly worn and turned into e-waste long before they normally would without those USB cables being plugged into them.
Okay, but you're only looking at the 10 keyless keyboards. Most people use a full layout with a number pad.
Okay, fine. Then how about we take a look at those, even though I don't fucking want one that's not 10 keyless. Since I'm specifically looking for wired keyboards in this search, however, I'm going to filter out the wireless ones. I've already gone over the key switches issue, so it's not necessary to keep showing wireless, especially since wireless keyboards aren't inherently bad or useless. The issue, after excluding the key switches, is the means by which wired keyboards are actually wired. Okay, fine. The issue seems to be less prominent with full-size keyboards, but you can't argue that it doesn't still exist. For the Amazon TKL keyboard search, there were 44 keyboards found in 3 pages of results, and 18 of those keyboards required a USB cable to be plugged into them. For the full-size keyboard search, after excluding the wireless and TKL keyboards that came up in the results, there were 47 results, with 16 of them that required a USB cable to be plugged into them. Of course, we have to be a little more fair, since those 44 from the TKL keyboard search does also include the wireless ones. So if we exclude the 17 wireless and 5 that couldn't be determined, you're left with 22 wired keyboards, and 4 of them were hardwired. So, okay, fine. It's quite a bit better when looking at a full-size keyboard if you look at that ratio. Looking at this in terms of a percentage, the Amazon search for TKL keyboards had 18.18 repeating percent for hardwired keyboards and 77.27 repeating percent for keyboards that required a USB cable to be plugged into them, being a 17 to 22 and 2 to 11 ratio respectively. For the full-size keyboards search, this changes in a rather significant way, bringing it to about 34% for hardwired and about 66% for keyboards that required a USB cable to be plugged into them. This is still a rather bad margin though, and if you consider how prominent it already is, there's the real potential and likelihood of a USB cable plugging into the keyboard as a requirement being more common in the future. Although, I will also admit that it's fair to say that claim is a fallacy, but we do have evidence that it's made its way into both types of keyboard layouts, even though it's not needed and costs more to do so. You also have to consider how the USB port is a weak point and that manufacturers do typically push for maximizing profits, even if it means implementing something that can be considered planned obsolescence. Greed has to greed, after all. What about Newegg's search? Well, let's take a look. For most of these, you can assume they're hardwired based on the appearance of the cable, as USB cables tend to have a different design that doesn't contain a corrugated piece of plastic. However, without being able to actually see the point of attachment or insertion, that's the furthest you get. But because this is so common, I'm considering the keyboards with that design in its cable as being hardwired if I can't actually directly see the part of the keyboard where the cable attaches or inserts. If it doesn't have this detail and I can't see that attachment or insertion area, then it's deemed as being indeterminable, with the appearance factor being given as to the potential of its skew. I mention this here and not with Amazon search results because Amazon has far more reviewer images submitted than Newegg does, so those images make such factors far easier to figure out. If a manufacturer doesn't actually supply the seller with such images, then it's their own fault, as most people aren't going to bother going to their site to look it up. They'll just skip it if it doesn't appear like what they want. Thus, I'm not using those manufacturer sites. This uncertainty is another part of the problem. If you can't tell whether a keyboard does or doesn't require a USB cable to be plugged into it, it makes it easier for the manufacturers to boil you into acceptance of all keyboards requiring a USB cable being plugged into them. If a manufacturer doesn't actually want to do this, but they still don't show the attachment or insertion point of the cable, then it's also a failure of marketing on their part. They should be aware of the fact that such differences between keyboards exist, so they need to do their due diligence in displaying which theirs is. With that said, Newegg's search results are more promising than Amazon's are, as after excluding the ones that can't be determined and after excluding the ones that aren't related to the search, the numbers are low enough that it's not even necessary to grab some ratio. Only 2 of the keyboards on the first Newegg search results page actually require a USB cable to be plugged into them. However, out of the 38 wired keyboards in those search results, 11 of them couldn't be determined which they were. Most of those that couldn't be determined do at least appear as though they're hardwired, but just as a reminder, you also still can't simply assume they are. Keyboards may appear to be hardwired while still actually requiring a USB cable to be plugged into them. Appearances aren't always what they may actually be, but the results of the full-size keyboards do at least suggest that the problem is less widespread than with TKL. With that said, the manufacturers do know the issue of wear from USB cables is a real problem, so you may find the rare occasion when they add a cable harness or a special plug sheath to the cable, both of which are meant to help stabilize the cable and prevent that wear and tear. If they're aware of the issue and are trying to actually help prevent it, then why the hell is it a USB cable to begin with? Remove the USB portion and just swap it back to a hardwired plug. Adding some harness or sheath isn't a solution, it's a bandage over a festering wound, and whether or not it's even effective is arguable, as it's merely helping to hold the cable still and not necessarily preventing its motion. Those attaching points can't actually hold the plugs perfectly still. Since they aren't soldered in place, they just use a clamp. Clamps that are subject to the whims of temperature and the wear and tear of pressures applied from use. They'll all eventually just turn into South Park's Saddam head, bobbling back and forth like Satan's little bitch. Again, every little motion will wear it down. It doesn't matter what type of USB plug or port is used, they all have a limited lifespan. Even my Xbox controller can no longer be used with a cable because it has the exact same type of design issue as these keyboards, and its port was worn out from use. The cable I used still works, though it's now rather loose, but the port on that controller sure as shit doesn't. Just like with the controller, if these manufacturers really want to do this for some portability feature, they could just as easily release 2 versions of the same device, just like what was done in the past. Yeah, back when Xbox 360 was a thing, you were able to purchase either a wireless controller or you could purchase a hardwired controller. Previous keyboards had similar options. You used to be able to choose between a wireless keyboard and a hardwired keyboard, but now a large percentage of them require a USB cable to be plugged into that keyboard, regardless of whether or not it can actually be used without that cable at all. And honestly, I hate to say it, but this isn't really anything new, it's just something different. Back when IBM was popular, there were keyboards with mechanical keys. No, I'm not talking about the mechanical keys you know from today, the modern things of varying quality and numerous differing types that bogs it down. But more on that in a minute. I'm talking about the tactile keys of keyboards like the IBM Model F and Model M variants. Keyboards that had buckling spring key switches, keyboards that had consistency in feeling and recognition of inputs, leading to a greater typing accuracy. Now, sure, they were louder, and their overall layout was arguably inferior to today's, but those key switches certainly weren't inferior, they were actually far superior. So, what happened, and why are we now where we are? Again, just like with the cables, it was money. However, unlike with the cables, it was less malicious. Those buckling spring key switches were replaced with membrane key switches, which is still one of the most commonly used types today, as they're cheaper to produce than those buckling spring, or even modern-day mechanical key switches, such as the Cherry MX Blues. When I was a kid, I actually used some of those IBM keyboards with the buckling spring key switches, and up until I got a computer in high school, one with Windows XP that replaced the old Windows 3.1 system I had beforehand, I had an IBM Model M, or the Model F. I'm not entirely sure, as the Model F sounds more accurate, but my auditory memory of it could be wrong, since the actual appearance of the Model M is exactly as I remember. During high school is when the systems I used started using those membrane key switches far more commonly, to a point that the buckling spring were completely phased out. Now, instead of the incredible IBM mechanical key switches, we have to sort through and choose between numerous available brands, each with their own design on the specific colors of those key switches. Each color is meant to indicate a feel and sound of the key switch, which sounds like it would help keep things clear and make it not matter which type you get as long as it's the color you prefer, but it's not that simple. Cherry, Kale, Razer, Logitech, Rocat, Altimu, Gateron, Drop, Zeal PC. That's 9 different brands, each with their own key switches, each with their own responsiveness, lifespan, level of sound, and feel. The ones you may have commonly heard of are likely to be Cherry, Gateron, Razer, and Logitech, and among those 4 types, you may have also heard of the key switch colors of red, green, blue, black, and brown, but those aren't the only ones. With just those 5 types from those 4 different brands, you still end up with a total of 20 different types of key switches to choose from, and that's despite being less than a third of the total available I was able to find a list of with minimal searching. How are you supposed to know whether you want a Cherry MX Blue, a Gateron Blue, a Logitech GX Blue, a Kale Blue, or an Altimu Blue? What if you want something similar to a blue that's not actually a blue? Well, you could look at a huge list of key switch types and compare their specs. You can look at the actuation force, the actuation point, the total travel, and the switch type to determine type of sound, the force required, and the feel. But these pieces of information lack obvious context. Unless you've actually had the ability to test and use the types for yourself, how are you to know whether or not it's what you actually want? It's not that the options are bad either, it's that there are far too many to choose from. There are far too many that are far too similar, with each brand trying to make their own proprietary thing, with there being nothing that's actually standardized. Those key switches are also pretty expensive, so if you get something you don't actually like, much like the first modern mechanical keyboard I purchased over a decade ago, which had Cherry MX black key switches, you're kinda screwed. You'd either have to return the keyboard you don't like, which can sometimes occur a restocking fee, or just roll with it until you waste your money on a different keyboard with different key switches. If the number to choose from was consolidated, if it was much easier to parse the information and actually make a choice, this wouldn't be such an issue. If something happens to the USB port on the keyboard, it's quite possible your return could be rejected. Of course, you could argue that the chance of damage occurring to that USB port is relatively low before you decide you want to return it and try for something different, but it's still another variable in the problem. Modern keyboards are simply collapsing. Even the one I've been using to type out this entire script, being a Cooler Master CK530V2, uses a lower quality blue key switch than the CK530V1 did. This newer version also has an issue with inputs sometimes either not registering or being registered twice, as mentioned earlier. Input registry is surely an issue, but that's something you're not likely to really know is an issue until you've had and used the keyboard for a long enough span of time. And where keyboards were making advancements to ensure any number of keys could be simultaneously pressed at once while still having the inputs of every key detected, that feature still isn't all that common. In some cases, the design of a keyboard may prevent a specific combination of 2 keys from being pressed, such as Shift and a single letter key, much like one of my spare, cheap keyboards that's meant to be used in emergencies where the Shift key isn't necessary. Many have different input combinations that are outright restricted, but then you also have some keyboards that are restricted based on a total number rather than a specific combination. That specific number is potentially better, though it depends on the individual use case scenario. The inarguable fact is that having 0 restrictions on how many keys you can press is still the best, and it is something that's possible, it's just rather rare. Regular typing can be easily ruined by a limited input, especially if there's a delay before the input is fully cleared from the count in combination after the input has actually been released. If there's this ghosting issue, then you could find yourself running into a problem where the next key you press isn't registered, even though the previous one was released just a moment earlier. This is less of an issue for people who type than those who game, as games will require multiple keys to be pressed at the same time, but if your typing is fast enough, you could still run into the issue. So how could this be fixed? How could we actually get the option to use a keyboard without a USB cable that's plugged directly into the keyboard, without the stress and confusion over the type of key switches, and without the limited key inputs? Honestly, I'm not going to be one of those optimistic people who just say, vote with your wallet, because when the hell has that ever really worked? The number of people it requires for that sort of action to be actually effective is absolutely immense. Voting with your wallet requires a huge number of people to take the same action, to be enough for a long enough span of time that it actually starts to impact the manufacturers. But people are fucking stupid. People either don't bother with this, or they'll cave within a shockingly short span of time. This is seen all the time when people call for boycotts, as there will commonly be an initial coalition against something, but it rarely lasts long. After a short while, people forget, and those companies they were boycotting get a rebound as all those who were boycotting them then turn around and go back in droves. A small dip is all that's caused, and it's rarely anything more. To make matters worse, everything I've mentioned here is something that's spread to practically every manufacturer, not just one or a few of them. So again, how the hell can it be fixed? In reality, there isn't a solution. Those who care about it enough to make some noise, those who bitch about it like I'm doing now, we're all in the minority. No matter how much we complain, unless someone actually has an incorruptible spirit and the financial capital to go along with it, someone who can create true competition in a pro-consumer fashion, there is nothing that can be done. The issue with the cables could potentially be argued as being wasteful, as the planned obsolescence of it is certainly an issue that could have some laws placed against it, but the chance of this happening is also low. Again, it would take a large number of people to get something like that through, and the corrupt politicians would have to feel pressured into passing such a thing to begin with by feeling like they'd lose their position if they refused or sided with the manufacturers who want this level of enshittification to persist. Those who pay millions in lobbying. I don't want computers to turn into some pile of shit. I want them to be better, and that includes keyboards. I want keyboards to be something that's easier to sort through, something that's more affordable, something that can last and be more worth the cost. The vast majority of what I do with my life revolves around the use of computers, which includes the use of a keyboard, and it's what I enjoy the most in life. There's very little I do enjoy in life, and there's very little I can find to enjoy in life, as my disabilities prevent me from the usual activities others may partake in. This is something that's considerably small when compared to the countless issues facing societies in the world, but just because it's small, it doesn't mean it's irrelevant. A single termite may be easily squashed, but a colony may destroy a house, much in the same way that small problems can be easily added to a list of others and become themselves a part of a huge problem. But really, who the fuck is going to listen to me? I'm just some asshole who gets pissed about a lot of things, someone with a small voice no one will care to listen to. Even without an immediate solution, I at least recognize the fact that pointing out the problem is the first step required in fixing it. Others, though, I'm sure they'll ignore me. They'll look at me as someone who's wrong, someone who's an idiot, because why wouldn't they? People have done that to me my whole life. If I end up being right, though, this issue will only continue to get worse. Hell, I'm even certain there'll be people who mock me for this whole rant. It's just keyboards after all, so who the hell cares, right? Again, it's just one termite, but I'd much rather have those little issues dealt with before they grow into that colony, not wait until everything's collapsing around us. We already have enough of that happening as it is. If you watched this entire video, thank you for listening. This is a new series I'll be doing whenever there's something I feel the need to bitch about, but it won't have a set schedule. There's the possibility that these videos will be rare and spread far apart, but each one will be scripted and edited. The only exception to this will be the Comcast Gateway issue I previously released a video on, as it's being grandfathered into this series. That video wasn't originally meant to be part of this series, but ever since I made it, I've been wanting to make other videos that point out more issues. So it's technically the one the idea was created from, and therefore its title has now been updated as Video 00 in the series. Other videos may cover more important topics, but I just felt the need to point this out first, because it's easier for me to deal with while still being something that's annoying the hell out of me.